In 1992, the FDA allowed GMOs onto the market without any required safety studies, without any labeling. The policy claimed that the agency was not aware of any information showing that GMOs were significantly different, so that the companies like Monsanto that told us that PCBs were safe and Agent Orange was safe and DDT was safe, they can determine if their GMOs were safe and just feed it to us. Well, it turns out the person in charge of policy at the FDA at the time was Monsanto's former attorney, later Monsanto's vice president, now the US Food Safety Czar. And the policy was lying. Documents made public from a lawsuit years later showed that the overwhelming consensus among the scientists at the FDA were that GMOs might create allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. They had actually urged their superiors to require long-term study, but were ignored. So we can listen to the political appointees, or we can listen to the scientists. I'd like to listen to the scientists and avoid GMOs. Doctors are saying, don't eat genetically modified foods. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine says all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets. So what is a genetically modified food? They take genes from one species, bacteria, viruses, and force them into the DNA of other species. Animal feeding studies, according to the American Academy, are linked to reproductive problems, organ damage, accelerated aging, etc. So how do we avoid eating genetically modified foods? If you can go to non-GMOshoppingguide.com and read thousands of products that are made without these genetically modified ingredients. Unfortunately, the government does not require labeling of GMOs in the United States like they do in Europe and many other countries. So we have to look for products that voluntarily say non-GMO. So go to the non-GMOshoppingguide.com and learn to avoid GMOs and take the doctor's advice. When you look at the evidence about the health dangers of genetically modified foods, it's overwhelming. Mice fed genetically modified soy had changes in their testicles and young sperm cells. Rats, the testicles changed from pink to blue. Also female rats, changes in uterus and ovaries. When they fed female rats genetically modified soy, more than half of the babies died within 3 weeks compared to only 10% when the mothers were fed non-GM soy. The babies were smaller and also unable to reproduce. When they fed hamsters for 2 years, by the third generation, most lost the ability to have babies. Some had hair growing in their mouths, and there was also a 5-fold increase in infant mortality. Mice fed genetically modified corn had fewer babies and smaller babies. So what are we doing to our kids with genetically engineered foods? Just say no to genetically modified foods to protect yourself and the next generation. Years ago, scientists found bacteria growing in a chemical waste dump near a factory, surviving the presence of Roundup herbicide, which normally kills bacteria. So they said, great, let's put it in the food supply. So they took the gene out of the bacteria that allowed it to survive the weed killer and put it into soybeans, so now the soybean plants can be sprayed with Roundup herbicide and not die. You have Roundup-ready soybeans. This is genetically engineered foods, designed to withstand more herbicide. The only human feeding study ever published on genetically modified foods surprised us all. Inside the DNA of bacteria living inside our intestines was the gene that they found in the chemical waste dump. These folks had Roundup-ready gut bacteria, meaning long after you stop eating genetically modified foods, you may have these genetically modified proteins produced continuously inside your own intestines. This could have serious medical consequences. In fact, there's corn genetically engineered to produce a toxic insecticide. It breaks open the stomach of insects and kills them. What if the gene that produces this toxin were also to transfer to your gut bacteria, turning it into a living pesticide factory? This is just one of the many studies that should have been done before they put this stuff on the market. A very recent study found this Bt toxin from this corn in the blood and fetuses of pregnant women. Maybe it's coming from the corn, maybe it's coming from their own gut bacteria. I don't know, but I would recommend avoid genetically modified foods at all costs. The biotech industry has spent more than $250 million trying to convince us that GMOs are needed to feed the world. No wonder so many people have bought into this myth. But the experts at Feeding the World say absolutely not. The most comprehensive evaluation, the ISTAD report, with 60 countries signing on, more than 400 scientists, say that the current generation of genetically modified foods have nothing to offer to feed a hungry world or eradicate poverty. In fact, an evaluation of yield statistics shows that the average genetically modified crop actually reduces yield, whereas sustainable methods increase yield dramatically, even doubling yield in millions of farms around the world. So if someone tells you that we need to use GMOs to feed the world, realize that that came from the boardrooms of public relations executives. It's not scientific. It has no weight. What's true is that GMOs actually reduce our ability to feed the world by taking money away from more appropriate technologies. The BP oil spill, the Japanese nuclear radiation leak. These are huge problems with long-lasting effects. The half-life of some of that radiation can go on hundreds of thousands of years. But in the race, the longevity between nuclear decay and genetic pollution, contamination from genetically modified crops that self-propagate in the species, GMOs win the race. The genes that we put out today can outlast the effects of global warming, nuclear waste, oil spills, all of it, because it spreads and continues to self-propagate in the ecosystem. We need to be very careful of the genes we introduce into our ecosystem, and we should have been. This is irreversible pollution, pollution with legs and wings. We need to stop it now, put it back in the laboratory, and understand it fully before we ever deploy it again. The deployment of genetically modified foods creates unprecedented risks. Not only are we feeding the products of this infant science to the entire population, we're releasing the products into the environment where they can never be recalled. The genes already released, because they self-propagate in the gene pool, can outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste. We should have had our defenses up before introducing these, using every possible excuse to say no until we were absolutely sure that these were safe for food and for the environment. We weren't. In fact, scientists were warning over and over again about the dangers, and now those warnings have been validated. We are giving a very dangerous gift to our future generations. Our great-great-great-great-grandchildren are knocking at our door saying, "What did you do when you found out that genetic engineering was dangerous for health and the environment? Did you stop it? Did you take some steps to pull it back from the environment, to pull it back from the food supply?" I hope so, because I think together we can end the genetic engineering of the food supply and then speak to our great-great-grandchildren and say, "Yes, we were there for you. We stopped this dangerous experiment before it got out of hand." They just approved Roundup-ready alfalfa, genetically engineered alfalfa, engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup. This is a catastrophe. Roundup-ready crops are already the most popular crops, the biggest acreage of crops that are genetically engineered. So millions and millions of pounds of Roundup is sprayed now, which is causing a catastrophe because it pulls nutrients out of the food supply. It promotes diseases in the soil. It's linked to endocrine disruption, to birth defects, to possible cancer. So the use of Roundup is now going to skyrocket because of the approval of Roundup-ready alfalfa. We didn't need it. Alfalfa is not generally sprayed with weed killer anyway. In fact, 93% of all the acreage of alfalfa is not sprayed with weed killer. So why did the USDA approve Roundup-ready alfalfa? Because of influence by Monsanto, not because of science, not because of what we want. So we need to ask our food companies, don't use any products from animals that have been fed GM alfalfa. Let's kick it out of the market. In a January 1999 biotech conference in San Francisco, a company arrogantly predicted that within 5 years, they would be able to replace 95% of all commercial seeds in the world with genetically engineered seeds. They wanted to replace nature. But 3 weeks later, their plans crashed. When the gag order on a scientist in Europe was lifted, and he was finally able to speak about the dangers of genetically engineered foods. Within a month, 750 articles were written. Within 10 weeks, the tipping point of consumer rejection was achieved, and within a week, virtually every major food company committed to stop using GM ingredients in their European brands, but not in the US. It was consumer concern that kicked GMOs out of Europe, and it's consumer concern that will kick GMOs out of the United States. In fact, the bovine growth hormone from the genetically modified drug has been kicked out of Walmart and Starbucks and Yoplait and Dannon and most American dairies because consumers are learning about its potential link to cancer. Now people are learning about the dangers of genetically modified foods as well. We believe that as little as 5% of US shoppers, 15 million Americans, avoiding genetically modified brands would be sufficient to create a tipping point to kick them out of the market. So be part of that tipping point. Learn about the health dangers of GMOs, learn how to avoid them, and let's together reclaim a non-GMO food supply. Doctors around the United States are telling patients don't eat genetically modified foods. In fact, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine says animal feeding studies link GMO foods to reproductive problems, immune disorders, gastrointestinal problems, accelerated aging, and organ damage. GMO foods are genetically modified. Genes from one species, like bacteria or viruses, are forced into the DNA of other species. How do we avoid GMOs? Well, unlike most industrialized countries, the United States does not require labeling. So we have compiled the companies that sell non-GMO products at nongmoshoppingguide.com. There you can search from thousands of products and take the doctor's advice to eat healthier, non-GMO foods for yourself and your family. Many people want to avoid eating GMOs. In fact, most Americans say they'd avoid GMOs if they were given a choice. But how do you do it when going out to restaurants? The way I do it is I call restaurants, first of all, that cook from scratch. Because if they use processed ingredients, it's going to be GMOs. I have to avoid the obvious GMOs in corn, like corn on the cob or polenta or things like that. And mayonnaise is basically made from soybean oil, which is genetically engineered. But the invisible ingredients would be the salad dressings or the cooking oil. So I ask, what oil do you cook with, or what oil is in your salad dressing? Olive oil is non-GMO. If it's soy, corn, cottonseed, or canola, it's genetically engineered. So I look for entrees that are without that, and then I'm safe. So you can avoid GMOs in restaurants. I do it all the time, but it takes a little work. What are you feeding your pets? I'd like to recommend to feed them non-genetically modified food. The animal feeding studies on GMOs showed organ damage, inflamed organs, larger organs, smaller organs, damaged immune system, potentially precancerous cell growth, higher infant mortality rates, sterile offspring, etc. These are animal feeding studies. We're talking about your animals. One veterinarian told me that when GMOs were introduced into the food supply in 1996, the incidence of allergies among cats and dogs went up dramatically. How does he handle it with his clients? He says, switch to the organic, non-GMO feed, and the symptoms go away. I would say, feed your pets non-GMO feed.
It's the most dangerous thing facing human beings in our generation.
GMO, genetically modified organisms. They take genes from one species and force it into the DNA of other species.
We have hundreds of millions of acres of genetically modified crops that have been planted in the United States, and yet most people are not aware.
I found out that our food supply is genetically modified. And guess what? The food that my son ate on August 25th, 2009 was raw corn. The corn that almost killed him.
The process of insertion plus cloning creates massive collateral damage. There can be hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA.
The things we're seeing today aren't normal.
Illnesses that weren't epidemic before are now epidemic.
We have gone from food in its whole food form to food undergoing a scientific experiment.
The havoc that it will cause will be across the entire spectrum of disease.
What the problem was is I guess he said that they weren't able to process the food correctly, and they would bloat up and die from it.
They can put it on the market without telling the FDA or to consumers.
It became clear that the FDA had been lying repeatedly since 1992.
It's not just an agriculture issue, it's not just a food industry issue, it's an ever-living creature issue.
And if we don't do anything within a decade, every single major crop with any significant market size is going to be genetically modified, and we're not going to know it.
The world can get rid of it. The world should get rid of it. The sooner the better, now.
We look at what they're eating, and we take out the genetically modified foods and the industry foods, and they all get better. It never doesn't work.
I don't want to be a human lab rat, and I certainly don't want my 2-year-old daughter to be a human lab rat.
It's not about feeding the world. It's not about the blind will see and the lame shall walk. It's about chemical companies selling chemicals.
What have I done to my children, and what has been done to them without my consent?